Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. You're safe here, so take a break, relax. But don't take too long. We have some grim work to do. Tonight we explore 6 medieval jobs that we believe none of our beloved audience would have the stomach to endure. So let us know in the comments if you think you're up for the task. If these sleepy stories have helped you drift off, you can like, subscribe and leave a comment. Thank you for helping this little channel grow. In the comments, say where you're watching from and what time it is there. You're not the only insomniac with secrets. Tonight, you crawl into cesspits with a tallow candle. You dig plague trenches until the lime burns. You bargain over jars of living stitches. You smoke a river of rats from the grain. You keep a bear from eating the audience. And when the bell demands it, you take the second swing. No metaphors, no alibis, just the jobs that keep a city alive by feeding it to you. Close your eyes. Feel the weight of warm sheets and the slow rise of your breath. Hear the crackle of the fire and the even hush of this voice. Let the room go still while the silence waits for you to remember what you've done. Now the air thickens with tallow smoke and torchlight. Wool itches your wrists. Damp stone cools your hands. Rushes whisper underfoot. A cart creaks past. Lime kisses the back of your throat, and a chain slides once against iron. The crowd holds its breath, and you steady yours. When the bell tolls, the town clock struck midnight, its bronze voice rolling through streets that pretended to sleep. And below those streets, in tunnels where daylight was a rumour and fresh air a forgotten luxury, Thomas the Gong farmer descended into his kingdom of filth. The rope was slick with the grease of 1,000 previous descents, each knot worn smooth by hands that knew better than to trust anything else in the dark. His tallow candle flickered on the leather cap, casting shadows that danced like drunken priests against walls that sweated history's worst secrets. The cesspit yawned beneath him, a mouth that had swallowed the town's shame for decades without complaint. Down here the air had weight and substance, thick enough to chew, tasting of copper pennies and bread left too long in summer heat. Methane hung in invisible clouds, waiting to turn a careless flame into underground thunder. The plan, as always, was beautifully simple. Fill the bucket, haul by hand, empty into the night soil cart, repeat until dawn's bells called honest folk to honest work. Thomas had done this dance for 15 years, long enough that his nose no longer registered the assault. Though newcomers to his trade often emptied their stomachs before filling their first bucket, the walls down here told stories in strata layers of human waste compressed into archaeological records of feast and famine, sickness and health, marked by the occasional glint of a dropped coin or lost wedding ring that no one would ever reclaim. His wooden bucket scraped against stone, the sound echoing in the narrow chamber like a spoon in an empty bowl. Above, a cart rattled over cobblestones, the vibration travelling down through earth and stone to shake loose a small cascade of semi-liquid history from the ceiling. The candle flame bent sideways in a sudden draught, and Thomas knew with the certainty of long experience that he had perhaps 3 breaths before the gas pocket found his light. He cupped his hand around the flame, but the draught was persistent, insistent, fatal. The candle died with a small hiss, plunging him into darkness so complete it had texture, pressing against his eyes like wet wool. In that darkness, the wall beside him shuddered and sloughed away, tons of accumulated filth sliding with the slow inevitability of an avalanche made of human waste. The mass caught his legs, pinning him against the opposite wall with pressure that made his knees sing, warnings his brain didn't want to interpret. His hands found the rope in the dark, muscle memory more reliable than sight, but the bucket was already full, its weight pulling at his shoulders like a drowned man seeking company. He pulled once, feeling the rope stretch and complain, wondering if 15 years of acid air had finally eaten through the hemp's heart. The mass around his legs settled another inch, accompanied by sounds that belonged in no Christian world. Wet whispers and liquid sighs that suggested the pit was considering whether to digest him properly. A cough escaped him, involuntary and dangerous in air that could ignite or poison with equal enthusiasm, and the cough became words he would never speak in church, but seemed appropriate for this underground cathedral of human necessity. Another pull on the rope, and this time something gave, either the rope or his shoulder, He couldn't tell which in the dark. The bucket rose incrementally, each inch a victory paid for in burning muscles and prayers addressed to saints who probably didn't monitor cesspits. Time became elastic down here, without light to mark its passage. His world narrowed to the rope, the weight, the slow suck of waste trying to claim his legs, and the metronomic drip, drip, drip of something overhead that might have been condensation, or might have been the ceiling preparing its own commentary on his situation. When his head finally broke the surface, moonlight hit his eyes like silver hammers. He blinked, gasped air that tasted impossibly sweet despite being directly above a cesspit, and hauled himself over the edge with arms that trembled like a newborn calf's legs. The bucket followed, brimming with tomorrow's fertilizer and yesterday's mistakes, sloshing contents that gleamed dully in the moon's judgment. His legs were caked to the thigh, a second skin of compressed waste that would require wire brushes and prayer to fully remove. But he was alive, which was more than some gong farmers could claim after 15 years of dancing with methane and unstable walls. The night soil cart waited patiently, its driver asleep on the bench, accustomed to these long waits between loads. Thomas tipped the bucket, watching the contents slide into the cart with the satisfaction of a job completed if not enjoyed. By dawn, these streets would be clean, their secret veins emptied and ready for another day's deposits. The good citizens would walk to market on cobblestones that didn't squelch, never wondering whose nighttime labour made their daytime dignity possible. Thomas would sleep through the morning market, dreaming of rope and darkness, while the town forgot he existed, until the next midnight called him back to his kingdom. He washed his hands in a bucket of lye water, the caustic bite eating at the filth, and taking a layer of skin with it as payment. His cottage sat at the edge of town, downwind and down market, where the rent was cheap and the neighbours scarce. As he trudged home, the eastern sky showed the first blush of dawn, painting clouds the colour of old rose petals. The town bells began their morning conversation, bronze tongues wagging about the promise of a new day. Thomas paused at his door, looking back at the town that would wake clean because of his work. Smoke began to rise from chimneys, breakfast fires lit by people who would eat their porridge without thinking of where yesterday's porridge had gone. He smiled, a private expression that would have puzzled anyone who saw it, and went inside to sleep the sleep of the professionally exhausted. Tomorrow night, tonight really, once the sun made its arc, he would descend again. The rope would be waiting, the bucket ready, the cesspit hungry. But for now he had earned his rest, paid for in the currency of other people's waste, and his own willingness to wade through it. The gong farmer slept, and the town breathed freely through its cleaned lungs, never knowing how close it had come to choking on its own necessary functions. The bells that had welcomed dawn now told a different tune, bronze voices gone sombre as they counted the night's casualties. William the digger heard them from his position knee-deep in yesterday's pit, checking the lime coverage one final time before the day's grim harvest arrived. The carts came with wheels wrapped in rope, a small mercy for the living who preferred their grief delivered quietly. They rolled through morning mist that clung to the ground like the earth's own shroud, hiding the ruts worn deep by too many similar processions. Each cart bore its cargo, wrapped in whatever fabric the family could spare. Fine wool for the merchant's wife, rough sacking for the tanner's children, sometimes nothing at all for the unnamed poor who died in alleys with only rats for mourners. The diggers assembled in the churned field that had once grown barley but now cultivated only grief. 6 men with shovels, backs already bent from yesterday's labour, faces wrapped in vinegar-soaked cloth that did nothing for the smell but gave the illusion of protection. William had been digging for 3 months now, ever since the pestilence turned from rumour to reality and the churchyard ran out of room for individual graves. The mathematics of death had become his daily bread, 6 feet deep, 12 feet wide, as long as necessary. Today's trench would need to be longer, he could tell by the number of carts waiting, patient as cows at milking time. The first bodies came tagged, when there was time for such niceties. Small strips of parchment tied to wrists, with the name and parish written in ink that ran in the morning dew. Margaret of Bread Street, Thomas the Younger, baby John, aged 4 days. Later, when the carts came faster and the families fewer, the tags would disappear. leaving only bundles of rapidly cooling meat that had once laughed, loved, and believed themselves immortal. William's shovel bit into earth that seemed eager to accept its new residents. The soil here was rich and dark, fattened by generations of burials that had turned human grief into agricultural wealth. Each spadeful brought up fragments of older deaths, a knucklebone white as chalk, a tooth that might have belonged to someone's grandmother, the rusted head of a nail from a coffin that had rotted away decades past. The rhythm of digging became hypnotic. Thrust, lift, toss, breathe. Thrust, lift, toss, breathe. The vinegar cloth made breathing difficult, but not as difficult as breathing without it when the wind shifted and brought the full bouquet of decomposition across the field. By mid-morning, the pit had grown to a respectable length, and the real work began. Bodies had to be laid out properly, not thrown or dumped, despite what the living might think of plague pit protocols. Even in mass death, there were proprieties to observe, small dignities that separated Christian burial from battlefield disposal. William and his crew worked in pairs, one at the shoulders, one at the feet, walking sideways like crabs along the pit's edge. The trick was not to think of them as people, but as problems to be solved. This one too tall for the standard spacing, that one too small to fill the gap. These two who might be arranged together to maximize efficiency. But then would come a tag with a familiar name, and the arithmetic of death would stumble over the equation of memory. Alice from Butcher's Row, who had sold him a meat pie last Michaelmas, her laugh like bells as she joked about his thin frame needing fattening. Now she was the one who needed to fit into a carefully measured space, her merchant's plumpness reduced to plague-thin bones in a wool shroud. He laid her gently at the pit's edge, taking more care than efficiency demanded, remembering that laugh and the way she'd always thrown in an extra bit of crackling for regular customers. The lime came next, great shovelfuls of white powder that burned the nose and throat even through the vinegar cloth. It fell like snow, if snow could burn, and had a hunger for flesh that matched the earth's appetite. The lime served two masters, speeding decomposition and discouraging the resurrection men who might otherwise come shopping for anatomist's specimens. William scattered it with the practiced motion of a farmer sowing grain, making sure every body received its alkaline blessing. The powder caught in his eyelashes, turning them white as an old man's, aging him decades with each handful. Where it touched exposed skin, it burned like cold fire, leaving marks that would last days and serve as a reminder of the day's work whenever he washed his face. The bells tolled noon, and still the carts came. The trench grew longer, a serpentine scar across the field that seemed to have its own appetite. The diggers worked in shifts now, some resting while others laboured, but the mathematics remained inexorable. More dead than hours in the day, more bodies than space in the ground. A child's body required special handling, not for any official reason, but because even plague-hardened diggers had limits. This one came with a wooden toy horse clutched in rigid fingers, the kind a father might have carved during long winter evenings when the future still existed. William didn't remove it, some treasures were meant for the grave, but he did ensure the child was placed between two adults, protected even in death from whatever loneliness the pit might hold. By late afternoon, the sun hung low and red as a plague boil in the western sky. The pit was nearly full, bodies arranged in their lime-dusted rows like words in some terrible book only God could read. The final cartload arrived just as the diggers were preparing to close the trench, and William recognised the driver. It was Thomas, the gong farmer, pressed into secondary service as the death carts overwhelmed their usual crews. Thomas looked exhausted, his nighttime labours followed by this daytime horror. But he handled the reins with the same methodical care he'd brought to his underground work. The last body bore no tag, no shroud, nothing but a face that might have been young or old, male or female, plague having erased such distinctions in its democratic hunger. William placed it, them, at the end of the row with the same care he'd shown the first, because professionalism meant maintaining standards, even when the world abandoned them. The closing was the hardest part, not physically, but spiritually. Earth fell on lime-white shrouds, with sounds that would follow the diggers home, infiltrating dreams already crowded with too many burials. Shovel by shovel, the day's work disappeared. returned to the earth that would transform tragedy into tomorrow's wildflowers. When the last shovelful fell, and the field showed only a raised mound where level ground had been that morning, the diggers stood in a rough line, hats removed despite the evening chill. Someone, William never knew who, began the paternoster, and 6 voices joined in, Latin worn smooth by repetition. The words rose with the smoke from evening cooking fires, a small rebellion against death's temporary victory. William washed his hands in the communal bucket, the water already grey with other men's ablutions. The soap was harsh lye that took dirt and skin with equal enthusiasm, leaving his hands red and raw but clean, at least as clean as they could be after handling death all day. He splashed water on his face, tasting lime dust and something else, something sweet, metallic that no amount of washing would remove. The walk home led past Thomas's cottage, and William saw the gong farmer already preparing for another night's descent. They nodded to each other, 2 men who dealt with what others couldn't face, united in the brotherhood of necessary but unmentionable labour. Tomorrow there would be more carts, more bodies, more lime-white rows, waiting for Earth's embrace. But tonight, William would eat his bread, drink his ale, and try not to count the faces he'd recognised among the day's dead. The plague pit was closed, the field briefly satisfied, and somewhere in town people were still living, still laughing, still believing themselves exempt from the democracy of death. The digger slept fitfully, dreaming of white snow that burned and earth that was always, always hungry. The marsh breathed with the patience of something that had existed before the town and would outlast it, exhaling mist that tasted of centuries. Robert, the leech collector, stood at its edge as the noon sun fought through clouds, checking the cloth strips tied around his calves one final time. The fabric had to be just right, not too tight to cut circulation, not too loose to fall off when weighted with feeding leeches. He'd learned this balance through trial and error, mostly error, in his first seasons when enthusiasm had exceeded wisdom. The water received him with the temperature of blood, neither warm nor cold but precisely calibrated to match the human body. This was no accident. The marsh knew its business, had been perfecting its craft since before the Romans came with their straight roads and strange gods. Leeches thrived here in the tea-coloured shallows, growing fat on fish blood and frog juice, waiting with invertebrate patience for something more substantial to wade within reach. Robert moved slowly, each step deliberate as a dance. The bottom sucked at his feet with intimate familiarity, mud between his toes speaking of centuries of decomposed reeds and the occasional lost shoe. His collection jar hung from his belt, thick glass that had once held preserves but now housed a writhing alphabet of medicinal promise. The first leech found him within minutes, a pioneer scout that attached itself to his left calf with the delicacy of a lover's kiss. He felt the triple bite, 3 jaws, each with 100 teeth, too small to see but not too small to feel, sawing through skin with mechanical precision. The anticoagulant hit his bloodstream immediately, a chemical negotiation between parasite and host that had been refined over millions of years. Where one scout succeeded, others followed. They came through the water like living punctuation marks, drawn by the warmth and the carbon dioxide and the 100 chemical signals that screamed food in a language older than words. Soon both calves were decorated with feeding leeches, each one a small comma of concentrated purpose. Robert counted as they attached, 5, 10, 15, 20. At 25 he would need to start harvesting, before the blood loss made him too dizzy to work safely. The marsh held other dangers than simple exsanguination. Men had been found face down in these shallows, their bodies decorated with hundreds of leeches like some aquatic funeral shroud. He moved deeper, following a channel where the water ran clearer and the leeches grew larger. The premium specimens lived here, each one worth twice the standard marsh leech at market. These were medical-grade parasites, their feeding habits predictable, their appetites moderate, their therapeutic value proven by centuries of use. A fat specimen attached itself just below his knee, and he felt the familiar tingle as it began to feed. The sensation wasn't entirely unpleasant. There was something almost meditative about being slowly drained by professionals who'd been perfecting their craft since before fish had legs. The anticoagulant made the bite sites weep continuously, thin streams of blood that attracted more leeches like iron filings to a magnet. At 20 leeches, the humming began. Not from the marsh, though it had its own sounds, subtle whispers of reed against reed, but from inside his own head, a gentle vibration that meant his blood pressure was dropping. Time to harvest the first batch before mathematics turned against him. He reached for the first leech, grasping it gently behind the head where the sucker couldn't maintain its grip. The removal required finesse. Too rough, and the leech would vomit its stomach contents back into the wound. Too gentle, and it would simply reattach somewhere else. He'd seen collectors who yanked them off like pulling weeds, leaving circular scars that never quite healed right. Into the jar it went, joining its companions in a writhing mass that looked like alphabet soup having a nightmare. The jar's water was carefully prepared, marsh water mixed with a touch of salt, just enough to keep them healthy, but not enough to make them purge their valuable blood meals. Each leech could hold up to 5 times its body weight in blood, making them little living storage vessels for the barber surgeons who would buy them later. One by one he harvested, working his way up from ankle to knee, saving the fat, prize specimen for last. That one came off with an audible pop, leaving a perfect triangular bite mark that would bleed for hours despite the cloth he pressed against it. The blood ran pink through the bandage, diluted by marsh water and anticoagulant. With the first batch secured, he moved to a fallen log he'd used as a resting spot for 3 seasons now. The wood was soft with rot, carved by his repeated visits into an almost comfortable seat. He elevated his legs, letting gravity slow the bleeding while he caught his breath and let the humming in his head subside. The marsh continued its business around him, indifferent to his presence. Water striders skated past on surface tension. Dragonflies hunted in aerial acrobatics that would shame any human dancer. And somewhere in the deeper water, something large rolled over with a splash that might have been a pike, or might have been something better left unidentified. After 10 minutes, counted by the church bells that drifted across the water like bronze butterflies, he stood, tested his balance, and waded back in. The second harvest always went faster, the leeches drawn by the blood already in the water, eager to join the feast. This time he let them climb higher, decorating his thighs with their sleek bodies. The larger leeches preferred the thicker veins here, and he could feel each one tap into his circulation like tiny vampiric accountants balancing the books of his blood. By early afternoon, his jar was 3/4 full, a good harvest by any measure. His legs looked like they'd been painted with red tears, each bite mark weeping its tribute to the marsh's entrepreneurs. The weakness came in waves now, gentle but insistent, and he knew it was time to conclude business for the day. The walk back to shore required concentration, each step deliberately placed to avoid the deeper channels, where a dizzy spell could turn profitable enterprise into tragedy. His collection kit waited on a stump. Salt for the stubborn ones, cloth for bandages, and a small flask of what he generously called medicine, but was mostly cheap wine with herbs. The salt stung like judgment as he sprinkled it on the last few hangers-on, making them release their grip and curl into offended spirals. These went into a separate jar. The salt-touched ones would be sluggish for days and brought lower prices at market. He bound his legs with practiced efficiency, the cloth wrapping tight enough to slow the bleeding, but not so tight as to cut off circulation entirely. The wounds needed to weep. It was nature's way of cleaning them, washing out whatever marsh gifts the leeches might have left behind. Tomorrow, the bite marks would be purple neck bruises that would fade to yellow over a week, a professional patina that marked him as surely as any guild badge. The walk to market took him past the plague pit, where the diggers were already preparing tomorrow's trench. He recognized William among them, the man's face grey with exhaustion and lime dust. They nodded to each other, fellow harvesters in the economy of bodily fluids, though one dealt with blood flowing out and the other with bodies no longer flowing at all. The barber surgeon's shop squatted on Cutler's Row, its striped pole promising medical marvels that mostly amounted to bleeding, purging, and prayer. Master Aldrich waited in his leather apron, the stains on it mapping a career's worth of other people's misfortunes. He examined Robert's harvest with the eye of a man who knew quality, holding the jar up to the light to watch the leeches twist and coil. "Good size on these," he admitted grudgingly, the tone of a man who hated to pay full price for anything. "Beat that fat one there. Is that from the deep channels?" Robert nodded, knowing better than to oversell. The leeches spoke for themselves, each one a medical instrument refined by evolution and proven by practice. These would be applied to the temples of aldermen with headaches, the breasts of new mothers with milk fever, the blackened limbs of plague victims, in the eternal hope that bad blood could be drawn out before it poisoned the whole. The negotiation was brief. They'd done this dance too many times to need the full performance. Coins changed hands, clinking with the music of commerce, each one earned by Robert's blood and the Marsh's patience. The rate worked out to about a penny per pint of his blood, which seemed fair when you considered that most men bled for free. Master Aldrich transferred the leeches to his own jars, each one labelled with Latin names that made them sound more medical than they were. Terudo medicinalis, the medicinal leech, as if giving something a scholarly name changed its nature from parasite to physician. The fat specimen from the deep channel went into a special container marked Premium, for nobility only, its price trebled by location and label. Robert left the shop lighter in more ways than one. His purse held enough for bread, ale, and next week's rent, while his body worked to replace the pints donated to the Marsh's entrepreneurs. He stopped at the baker's, where Alice's daughter now worked the counter, with her mother's smile, but not yet her generous hand with the extras. The smell of fresh bread made his stomach clench with a hunger that went beyond food, his body craving substance to replace what had been taken. He bought a full loaf, still warm, and ate half of it on the walk home, feeling the wheat turn to blood in his veins through the everyday alchemy of digestion. His cottage sat between the fuller's yard and the tanner's pit, a location that ensured cheap rent and neighbours who didn't complain about the smell of marsh water and medical alcohol. He unwrapped his legs carefully, noting which bites still bled and which had begun the slow work of healing. Tomorrow he would need to rest. Even professional blood donors had limits. But the day after, the marsh would be waiting. It had been waiting for centuries, patient as stone, generous with its treasures for those willing to pay the price in blood. He mixed salt and vinegar for tomorrow's wound wash, prepared fresh cloth strips, and checked his collection jars for cracks. The tools of his trade were simple, but like all simple tools, they required respect and maintenance. A leech collector who grew careless with his equipment soon became a cautionary tale told in taverns. Another fool who thought he could outsmart the Marsh. As evening fell, Robert sat by his small fire, legs elevated on a stool, feeling his body slowly refill what had been taken. Somewhere in town, Master Aldrich was applying his purchases to patients who would never know whose blood had fed their healers. The leeches would gorge, drop off when sated, and be returned to the Marsh to digest their meals and await the next harvest. It was a cycle as old as medicine itself, this trading of blood for coin, health for wealth, suffering for salvation. Robert closed his eyes, listening to his pulse slowly strengthen, and dreamed of dark water and small mouths and the patience of things that knew how to wait. The afternoon sun slanted through gaps in the granary walls, turning grain dust into golden smoke that hung in the air like a miller's blessing. Edmund the rat-catcher stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior, while his ears catalogued the sounds that mattered: the rustle of grain, the whisper of small feet on wood, the intimate gnawing that meant someone's winter bread was being converted to rat food. His terriers waited beside him with the coiled patience of professionals, their bodies rigid with anticipation, but too well trained to move without permission. Meg and Mauler, named for their respective talents, she for her speed, he for his finishing work, had been hunting rats since they could walk. Their entire beings had been shaped by generations of breeding for this one purpose: to be living weapons against the army that competed with humans for every grain of wheat. The granary stretched before them like a cathedral built to worship food security, its beams heavy with the weight of the town's survival. Every kernel stored here represented hours of labour, days of prayer, weeks of weather watching. And underneath it all, in the spaces between floorboards and behind walls, lived the other residents, the ones who paid no rent but took their tithe nonetheless. Edmund unpacked his kit with methodical care: sulphur fuses wrapped in oiled cloth, metal plates to seal exits, thick leather gloves that bore the scars of 1,000 battles, and the clubs. Short, weighted, efficient. The sacks came last, sturdy canvas that could hold a dozen rats without tearing, though he'd need more than one sack today. The signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them. Droppings fresh as morning dew, gnaw marks on the support beams, and that particular smell, musky, sharp, confident. That meant a colony in full prosperity. The miller watched from a safe distance, wringing his hands like he was washing them in air. "Started 3 weeks back," he said, his voice pitched high with worry. Thought my cats would handle it, but..." He gestured helplessly at a tabby cat sitting in a shaft of sunlight, studiously ignoring the sounds of rodent industry beneath the floorboards. Edmund nodded, unsurprised. Once rats reached critical mass, cats became decorative rather than functional, their hunting instincts overwhelmed by the sheer mathematics of the situation. A single rat was prey. 100 rats were a civilization, complete with their own economy, hierarchy, and military doctrine. He began the ritual of preparation, each step honed by years of practice. First, the exits. Every hole bigger than his thumb got a metal plate, every gap stuffed with oakum soaked in tar. The rats needed to have nowhere to run, except into his killing ground. This was chess, not checkers, and the first rule of rat catching was to think 3 moves ahead of creatures who could think 2 moves ahead of most humans. The sulfur fusions came next, strategic placement being everything. Too much smoke and the rats would panic, streaming out in a living river that no amount of dogs and clubs could stem. Too little and they'd simply retreat deeper, waiting out the assault in the dark spaces humans couldn't reach. Edmund had learnt the perfect ratio through trial and error, mostly error in his early days when overconfidence had led to spectacular failures. He lit the first fuse, watching the yellow smoke begin its slow crawl beneath the floorboards. The sulphur stank of hell's own pantry, making his eyes water even from a distance. The terriers whined, eager to begin, but he held them with a gesture. Timing was everything in this business. Too early and the dogs would meet organized resistance. Too late and the rats would have scattered beyond recovery. The sounds beneath the floor changed, shifting from comfortable industry to concerned conversation. Rats were social creatures, their squeaks and chittering a complex language that conveyed everything from "food here" to "run for your bloody lives." Right now they were in the debate phase, weighing options, calculating odds. Edmund lit the second fuse, then the third, creating a triangle of smoke that would drive the rats toward the center of the granary, where he'd left a carefully calculated gap in the defenses. The smoke began to thicken, yellow fog creeping across the floor like a mustard-colored tide. Somewhere in the walls he heard the first sounds of real panic, high-pitched squeals, and the thunder of tiny feet, all moving in the same direction. "Now," he said, and released the terriers. Meg shot forward like an arrow made of muscle and fury, her body low to the ground, every sense focused on the hunt. Mauler followed, less graceful but no less determined, his heavier build perfect for the close-quarters combat that would follow. The rats erupted from their carefully directed exit point like water from a broken dam, a brown, gay flood of fur and teeth and desperation. The first wave met Meg head-on, and she became a blur of efficient violence, her jaws snapping with the rhythm of a weaver's shuttle. Each bite was precise, a quick shake to break the neck, a toss to clear the mouth, then on to the next. She didn't eat them. This was work, not dinner. Edmund waded in with his club, bringing it down in measured strokes that turned panic into stillness. There was an art to it. Too hard and you splattered, making a mess that would need explaining. Too soft and the rat might recover, ready to bite the hand that failed to kill it properly. He'd been bitten 17 times in his career, each wound a lesson in the importance of complete commitment to the strike. Mauler had cornered a particularly large specimen, probably the colony's patriarch, a rat so fat on stolen grain it could barely run. The two circled each other with the wary respect of professional fighters, the rat's yellow teeth bared, Mauler's hackles raised like a warrior's plume. The fight was brief but vicious, ending when Mauler got the neck hold he'd been maneuvering for, his jaws closing with the finality of a bear trap. The smoke continued to pour from below, driving out the stragglers and the clever ones who'd thought to wait out the first assault. These met Edmund's club, or the terrier's teeth, adding to the growing pile of small corpses that represented victory over vertebrate competition. His glove saved him when a cornered rat launched itself at his hand, its teeth punching through the leather but not quite reaching skin. He shook it off, brought the club down, and made a mental note to check the glove for repairs. Equipment failure in this business meant blood poisoning at best, death at worst. Rat bites festered like nothing else, their mouths harbouring a devil's pharmacy of disease. The battle raged for 20 minutes that felt like hours, the granary floor becoming a battlefield littered with the fallen. The terriers worked with mechanical efficiency, their early enthusiasm tempered by the rhythm of sustained killing. Edmund's arm ached from swinging the club, his shoulders burned from the constant motion, but stopping meant giving the rats time to regroup, and regrouping meant failure. Finally, inevitably, the flood became a trickle, then isolated individuals making desperate breaks for freedom. These were the smartest or the luckiest, the ones who'd found some overlooked exit or had waited until the dogs were distracted. Edmund picked them off with thrown clubs, a skill he'd developed over years of practice, each throw calculated to intercept a running rat at exactly the right moment. When the last rat fell, and the granary grew quiet except for the dogs panting, Edmund surveyed the battlefield. The count was impressive. 47 rats, ranging from youngsters the size of his thumb to veterans the length of his forearm. Each one represented pounds of grain saved, loaves of bread that would reach human mouths instead of rodent bellies. The miller crept closer, his face a mixture of relief and disgust at the sheer number of his unwanted tenants. "Christ's blood," he whispered. "I had no idea there were so many." Edmund began the less glorious, but equally important task of collection, filling his sacks with the cooling bodies. These would be burned outside town. Rat corpses bred disease as efficiently as live rats bred more rats. Some rat catchers sold the pelts, but Edmund had seen too many men sicken from handling infected fur to make that gamble worthwhile. As he worked, he noticed the bite on his glove had gone deeper than he'd thought, the leather parted cleanly by teeth designed to gnaw through wood. He unwrapped the bandage he always carried, soaking one end in the harsh grain alcohol the miller used to clean his equipment. The alcohol burned like liquid fire as he poured it over the wound, but burn was better than fever. He'd seen rat catchers die from infected bites, their arms swelling like sausages, their minds wandering in fever dreams while their bodies fought a losing battle against blood poisoning. Prevention was worth any amount of momentary pain. The terriers sat panting, their muzzles red with their work, tails wagging with the simple joy of a job well done. Edmund gave each a handful of dried meat from his pouch, their wages paid in protein and praise. They'd earned it. Without dogs, rat carrying became a defensive action, humans reacting to rodent initiatives rather than taking the fight to the enemy. The miller paid without haggling, the pile of corpses speaking more eloquently than any invoice. The coins were warm from his purse, each one representing grain saved and disaster averted. Edmund added a small surcharge for the sulphur, imported and expensive it had to be accounted for, and threw in advice for free. "Get better cats," he said, nodding at the tabby still sunning itself, supremely indifferent to the day's drama. "Or at least hungrier ones. And check your walls monthly. 1 hole leads to 10, 10 leads to this." He gestured at the laden sacks. The walk to the burning grounds took him past the marsh, where Robert the leech collector was just emerging from his day's harvest, both legs wrapped in blood-stained cloth. They nodded to each other, two men who'd spent their afternoon bleeding for their bread, though in very different ways. The burning ground sat downwind of town, a patch of scorched earth where things too dangerous for normal disposal met their end. Edmund built his pyre with practiced efficiency. Dry wood at the base, the rat corpses layered with more wood, the whole thing doused with the remaining grain alcohol. The fire caught quickly, burning hot and clean, reducing disease and death to ash that would harm no one. He watched the smoke rise, calculating whether he had time for another job before dark. The baker had sent word of sounds in his walls, and the church had reported missing communion wafers, sure signs of rat activity. But his shoulders ached, the bite on his hand throbbed despite the alcohol, and wisdom suggested rest over revenue. The terriers agreed, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by the satisfied exhaustion of workers who'd earned their evening meal. They walked home together, through streets beginning to fill with evening traffic, merchants closing shop, workers heading to taverns, children called in from play by mothers who knew that darkness brought dangers worse than rats. Edmund's cottage sat behind the blacksmith's forge, another cheap rent made bearable by his profession's tendency toward unpleasant smells. He kennelled the dogs, making sure they had fresh water and clean straw, checking each for injuries that might need attention. Meg had a small cut on her ear, probably from a near miss with rat teeth, which he cleaned and salved with the same care he'd given his own wound. Inside, he unwrapped his hand properly, examining the bite by candlelight. The teeth marks were clean, 2 perfect punctures that would scar into another professional badge. He soaked the wound again in alcohol, gritting his teeth against the burn, then wrapped it in fresh linen boiled in salt water. With luck, it would heal clean. Without luck. But that was tomorrow's worry. He ate his simple meal, bread, cheese, and ale, while planning tomorrow's campaign. The baker's rats would be easier, confined to a smaller space with fewer bolt holes. The church rats might prove trickier. Sacred spaces had a way of harbouring the cleverest rodents, the ones who'd learned that humans behave differently around altars and wouldn't pursue quite so vigorously. As full darkness fell, Edmund heard the familiar sounds of his neighbour Thomas preparing for another night in the cesspits. Through his window, he could see William the plague pit digger trudging home, lime dust making him ghostly in the moonlight. They were all part of the same machine, really. Men who did what others couldn't or wouldn't, keeping the town functional through the simple expedient of being willing to get dirty. He checked his equipment one last time before bed. Clubs cleaned and oiled, gloves drying by the fire, sulphur stores adequate for tomorrow's work. The terriers were already asleep, chasing dream rats through endless granaries, their legs twitching with remembered victories. Edmund wrapped his throbbing hand carefully, protecting it for the night, and lay down to his own dreams. Tomorrow there would be more rats, more battles, more small victories against the tide of teeth and hunger that forever pressed against civilization's edges. But for tonight, the granary was clean, the grain was safe, and 47 fewer competitors would breed their exponential armies. It was enough, meaning it had to be. Evening painted the sky the colour of fresh bruises as Simon the Bearwood checked the chain one final time, running calloused fingers along each link with the attention of a man who'd learned that metal fatigue and bear rage formed an unfortunate partnership. The iron staple that anchored the whole arrangement to its post had been replaced twice this season. Once after a particularly energetic bout that had bent it nearly straight, once after rust had done what violence couldn't. The bear, Bruno, sat with the patience of a boulder that had learnt to breathe, occasionally shifting his massive weight from haunch to haunch. 8 years they'd been working together, ever since Simon had bought him as a cub from Slavic traders who'd smelled of pine resin and foreign vowels. 8 years of twice-weekly performances, of careful feeding schedules, of learning to read each other's moods, like an old married couple who communicated in grunts and gestures. The pit formed a rough circle of packed earth, surrounded by wooden barriers just high enough to discourage casual invasion, but low enough to let paying customers see the action. Already the crowd was gathering, faces flushed with ale and anticipation, coins warming in pockets that would soon be emptied by wagers. The evening's entertainment was a careful orchestration of violence and spectacle, balanced on the knife's edge between boring and fatal. 3 mastiffs waited in their cages, each one a carefully bred engine of muscle and aggression. Their owner, a pinch-fade man named Aldrich, who treated his dogs better than his wife, ran them through their paces, with short commands that snapped like whips. These weren't pets. They were professional fighters, their ears cropped to nubs, their bodies scarred from previous encounters with Bruno's claws. The drummer began his warm-up, a simple rhythm that would build throughout the evening, providing a heartbeat for the violence to come. The sound drew more spectators like moths to flame, each one eager to witness the ancient dance between wild and domestic, civilization and its discontents. Simon gave Bruno a final inspection, checking his muzzle for sores, his eyes for the cloudiness that might indicate illness, his coat for the parasites that plagued any creature forced to live in close quarters with humans. The bear endured the attention with resigned dignity, occasionally huffing breath that smelled of fish and fermented berries. Right then, Simon muttered, more to himself than the bear, "Let's give them their money's worth." He led Bruno into the pit with the casual confidence of long practice, though his free hand never strayed far from the iron-tipped staff that served as both prop and emergency measure. The crowd's noise rose like water filling a bowl, cheers and catcalls mixing with the clink of coins, changing hands as last-minute bets were placed. The first mastiff entered from the opposite side, all coiled energy and barely contained violence. It circled warily, generations of breeding warring with the instinctive knowledge that the creature before it was designed by nature to turn dogs into light snacks. Bruno watched with the lazy interest of a professional who'd seen it all before, his small eyes tracking the dog's movement without apparent concern. The mastiff struck first, as they always did, launching itself at Bruno's flank with jaws aimed for the thick muscle there. The bear pivoted with surprising grace, one massive paw sweeping around in an arc that caught the dog mid-leap and sent it tumbling across the pit. The crowd roared approval, coins glinting as they arced through the air to land at Simon's feet. Payment for a good show, encouragement for more. The mastiff recovered quickly, shaking its head to clear the stars, then circled again with newfound respect. This time it feinted left before darting right, teeth finding purchase on Bruno's shoulder before the bear could fully react. Bruno's roar shook dust from the barrier posts, a sound that reached into primal memories and squeezed. He shook like a wet dog, the mastiff holding on with professional determination until physics won and sent it flying again. This time there was blood on its muzzle. Not much. Bruno's hide was thick as boiled leather, but enough to show the crowd this wasn't mere theatre. The second mastiff was released while the first circled for another attempt, doubling the threat and halving Bruno's reaction time. They worked in concert, one distracting while the other attacked, a tactical approach that spoke of training and experience. Bruno rose to his hind legs, nearly 8 feet of muscle and fur and primitive authority, paws spread wide like a wrestler preparing to grapple with God. The crowd's noise reached fever pitch, a wall of sound that competed with the drummer's increasingly frantic rhythm. Simon watched the chain, always the chain, seeing how it pulled taut when Bruno moved, calculating angles and stress points. The bear dropped to all fours and charged, a movement so sudden that the nearest mastiff barely dodged aside. The chain snapped tight, and Simon heard the grinding sound of metal under strain that made his teeth ache. Time slowed as he watched the staple bend, rust flaking off like dried blood, the metal crying out its imminent failure. "Back!" he shouted, though his voice was lost in the crowd's roar. The third mastiff entered just as the staple gave way with a sound like a bell cracking. Bruno, suddenly free, stood confused for a moment by the absence of resistance, the chain dragging behind him like a metal tail. The crowd's cheers turned uncertain, a few of the cleverer spectators already backing away from the barriers. The mastiffs, sensing the shift in power dynamics, circled more warily, their trained aggression tempered by the knowledge that the rules had changed. Simon moved without thinking, years of experience compressed into instinct. He snatched the dragging chain, wrapping it around his arm while bringing the iron-tipped staff to bear. Bruno turned at the familiar pressure, and for a moment their eyes met, man and bear, each reading the other's intention in that space between heartbeats. "Easy, lad," Simon said, his voice pitched to carry calm through chaos. "Just another show, Just another evening's work." The bear huffed, a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been the prelude to mayhem. One of the mastiffs, bolder or stupider than its packmates, chose that moment to lunge. Bruno swatted it aside almost absently, his attention still on Simon and the chain, and the sudden universe of possibilities that freedom presented. The crowd had gone silent, that particular quality of quiet that preceded either applause or stampede. Simon could feel their eyes, hundreds of them, waiting to see whether this would end in spectacle or disaster. The smart money was probably on disaster. A loose bear in a crowded space rarely ended with everyone keeping their original number of limbs. He began to hum, a low, tuneless sound he'd used to calm Bruno since he was a cub. It was their private language, developed over thousands of hours together, meaning nothing to anyone else but carrying whole conversations between them. The bear's ears swiveled forward, listening, remembering. Slowly, carefully, Simon began to coil the chain, shortening the distance between them. Bruno allowed it, though his massive head swung back and forth, taking in the crowd, the mastiffs, the universe of options available to a bear with no anchor. One of the Mastiff's handlers, showing more courage than sense, entered the pit to retrieve his dogs. The movement broke whatever spell had held the scene in suspension. Bruno turned, fast as thinking, and the handler froze like a rabbit who'd just realized the grass had eyes. "Don't move," Simon said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd spent 8 years negotiating with 800 pounds of predator. "Just don't move." Time stretched like taffy. The handler stood statue still, sweat running down his face in rivers. The mastiffs whined, confused by the absence of clear direction. Bruno huffed again, a sound like the world's largest horse expressing skepticism. Then, with the casual decision of a creature who'd chosen commerce over carnage, the bear sat down. Just like that, the tension broke. The crowd exhaled collectively, nervous laughter rippling through their ranks like wind through wheat. Someone started a slow clap that built into genuine applause, appreciation for a show that had delivered more excitement than advertised. Simon felt his knees go weak, but kept his feet through pure professional pride. He finished coiling the chain, bringing Bruno back to heel with a combination of familiar pressure and sheer relief. The handler scrambled out of the pit, dragging his confused mastiffs behind him, dignity abandoned in favour of intact limbs. "Hello," Simon said to Bruno, who was now investigating whether anyone had thrown food along with the coins. "That's torn it." The evening's take would be good. Near-death experiences always loosened purse strings. But the damaged staple meant repairs, explanations, and probably a fine from the town council for endangering public safety. Still, everyone had kept their original complement of body parts, which counted as a successful evening in the Bearwood business. He led Bruno back to the holding area, a reinforced wooden structure that smelled of bear and old straw and a peculiar musk of controlled wildness. The bear entered willingly enough, the promise of dinner overcoming any lingering thoughts of freedom. Simon threw him a haunch of mutton that had gone slightly green. Bears had iron stomachs, and the meat was still better than what most of the town's poor would eat tonight. The crowd dispersed slowly, energized by their brush with danger, stories already growing in the telling. By tomorrow, the tale would have Bruno breaking free entirely, rampaging through the crowd while Simon wrestled him barehanded. By next week, there would be versions where the bear spoke Latin and demanded trial by combat. Such was the way of public entertainment. Reality was never quite exciting enough without embellishment. Simon collected the evening's coins, separating his take from what he owed the pit owner, the drummer, and the inevitable fine. The profit was still respectable, though he'd need to invest in better chains and staples before the next show. Iron wasn't cheap, but neither were bear attacks on paying customers. One of the mastiff handlers approached as he was counting, the pinch-faced Aldrich, who'd shown the good sense to stay outside the pit during the excitement. "Your beast nearly killed my dogs," he said, though his tone suggested more admiration than accusation. "My beast did exactly what bears do when chains break," Simon replied, not looking up from his counting. "Your dogs are fine. Bit of professional education, maybe, but fine." Aldrich grunted, then surprised Simon by adding an extra coin to the pile. "The show," he said. "Haven't seen a crowd that excited since the two-headed calf came through last summer." They parted on surprisingly good terms, united in the brotherhood of men who made their living from dangerous animals and dangerous crowds. Tomorrow there would be repairs to make, authorities to placate, and a bear to check for injuries that adrenaline might be hiding. But tonight, Simon had once again walked the line between entertainment and catastrophe, keeping his balance through luck, skill, and a bear who'd chosen cooperation over chaos. He gave Bruno one last look before heading home. The bear was gnawing contentedly on his mutton, apparently unbothered by the evening's excitement. 8 years they'd been partners, and Simon still wasn't sure which of them was training the other. The walk home took him past the granary, where the lingering smell of sulphur suggested Edmund the rat-catcher had been busy. Past the marsh, where tomorrow Robert would wade again for his blood-drinking harvest. Past the plague pit, where fresh earth showed today's additions to the town's growing congregation of the dead. They were all part of the same great machine, Simon reflected. Men and women who did the jobs that let civilization pretend it was civilized. He hefted his bag of coins, feeling the weight of another day's success in the currency of controlled catastrophe. Tomorrow he'd check every link in the new chain twice. Maybe 3 times. Because in the bearwood business, the difference between applause and amputation was measured in the strength of iron and the mood of something that remembered when humans were prey. Morning arrived wrapped in frost, the kind that turned breath to steam and made the scaffold's wood groan with cold contracted complaint. Henry the executioner stood in his workshop before dawn, running a whetstone along his axe blade with the patience of a man who understood that sharp mercy was the only mercy he could offer. The blade sang against the stone, a thin, metallic note that harmonized with the first bells calling the faithful to prayer. He'd been the town's headsman for 7 years now, inheriting the position from his father, who'd inherited it from his father, a dynasty of death dealers that stretched back to when the scaffold was just a tree and justice was less formal but no less final. The axe was German steel, imported at considerable expense, its edge maintained with an attention that surgeons might envy. A dull blade meant multiple strokes, meant suffering, meant a crowd that turned from spectacle seekers to stone throwers. In the plaza, the scaffold waited like a wooden altar to necessity. Fresh sawdust covered the platform, hiding the stains that no amount of scrubbing could completely remove. The block sat center stage, worn smooth by use, the depression where countless necks had rested, polished to an almost comfortable-looking curve. Henry arrived early, as was his custom, to check every detail before the crowd gathered. The hinges on the trapdoor, for hanging days, not today, the stability of the platform, the placement of the basket that would catch what the body released. These things mattered. Death might be common, but it needn't be sloppy. The branding irons lay in a brazier of coals, their ends glowing dull orange in the pre-dawn light. Someone had quenched them poorly after the last use, leaving crusty residue on the metal that would need wire bushing before they could mark clean. Henry set to work with the same methodical attention he brought to blade maintenance. A botched branding was almost worse than a botched beheading. The victim lived to display your incompetence. The town began to wake around him, shutters opening despite the cold, faces appearing at windows that overlooked the square. Execution days were complicated for the citizenry. Part holiday, part horror show, part reminder that civilization had teeth. The bakers did good business on execution mornings, selling penny loaves to spectators who wanted something to occupy their hands. The taverns would do better business afterward, helping those same spectators forget what their hands had applauded. By the time full daylight arrived, the crowd was forming. Henry recognized the regulars, the old women who attended every execution like others attended mass, the young men who watched with careful bravado, the pickpockets who found distracted crowds profitable, the priests who came to offer last rites and stayed to observe justice that claimed divine mandate. Today's condemned arrived in the traditional cart, hands bound, flanked by guards who looked everywhere but at their charge. Margaret Alyshire, convicted of poisoning her husband with ratsbane in his porridge, though half the town suspected he'd had it coming, given his fondness for fists and drink. She sat straight back despite the jolting ride, wearing her best dress as if attending church. Henry helped her down from the cart with professional courtesy. He'd learned long ago that small kindnesses cost nothing and made everything easier. A condemned person who felt respected was less likely to struggle, to scream, to turn what should be a solemn moment into a wrestling match that diminished everyone involved. "Good morning, Mistress Alyshire," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Fine morning," she replied, then laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Though I suppose fine is relative, isn't it? The priest stepped forward to perform last rites, his Latin rolling over the crowd like a blanket. Henry used the time to make final preparations, positioning the basket, checking his footing, rolling his shoulders to loosen muscles that would need to move with precise violence. The block waited, patient as stone, its wood dark with absorbed history. When the religious formalities concluded, Henry guided Margaret to the scaffold steps. She climbed without assistance, chin high, meeting the crowd's mixed gaze with one of her own. At the top, she paused, looking over the assembled faces. Neighbours, customers from her market stall, perhaps even friends, though friendship was a fair-weather thing when poison was involved. The charges were read by a clerk whose voice cracked on every third word, whether from youth or nerves Henry couldn't tell. Margaret Alashear, you stand convicted of the murder most foul of your lawful husband Thomas Alashear by means of poison administered with malice aforethought. The legal language droned on, transforming human tragedy into bureaucratic poetry. Margaret listened with the patience of someone who'd heard it all before at trial, her eyes fixed on something beyond the crowd, perhaps the marshes where mist still clung to the water, perhaps the church spire pointing at heaven like an accusatory finger, perhaps nothing at all. When asked for last words, she spoke clearly. I regret only that the ratsbane worked so slowly. He had 3 days to repent, more than he ever gave me to heal. The crowd murmured, divided between sympathy and scandal. Henry positioned her at the block with practiced efficiency, guiding her to kneel in a way that preserved what dignity remained. The neck had to be placed just so. Too high and the blow would catch skull. Too low and it would hit shoulders. There was a sweet spot, a particular vertebra, that separated cleanly when struck correctly. He'd made this strike hundreds of times, but his hand still checked and double-checked the positioning. "Who are you? Ready?" he murmured, giving her the small control of choosing her moment. She nodded once, decisively, and stretched her neck forward. The crowd held its breath. Time stretched like spun sugar, brittle and transparent. Henry raised the axe, feeling the familiar weight, the balance he'd adjusted over years to match his aging muscles. The blade caught the morning sun, throwing light across the scaffold, like a promise of swift passage. He swung. The physics of it was simple. Mass times acceleration equals force, force applied to a small area equals severance. But physics couldn't account for the way his shoulder twinged at exactly the wrong moment, a ghost of old injury choosing this instant to complain. The blade struck true but not clean, catching the target but not completing its work. Margaret made a sound, not a scream, more a confused exhalation, as if she'd been asked a question in a language she didn't speak. The crowd's collective intake of breath was louder than her pain. Henry didn't hesitate. Hesitation was cruelty disguised as shock. The second stroke was already in motion before the first had fully registered, his muscles moving with trained precision despite his mind's horror at the necessity. This time the physics worked as intended. Clean separation, quick conclusion, mercy delivered late, but delivered nonetheless. The crowd exhaled, some crossing themselves, others exchanging coins, as bets were settled on whether it would take one stroke or more. Human nature was what it was. Tragedy and commerce had been dancing together since Judas collected his silver. Henry cleaned his blade with the same care he'd sharpened it, wiping away evidence of his profession's imperfection. The body was removed with efficiency. The family had paid for proper burial rather than anatomist's display, a small dignity in death that poverty often denied. He descended from the scaffold on legs that trembled slightly, not from exertion, but from the adrenaline of imperfection. In 7 years, he'd needed a second stroke only 3 times. Each one burned in memory like a brand, a reminder that even the most practiced professional was only human, fallible, capable of adding suffering to an act that already contained its full measure. The crowd dispersed slowly, their morning's entertainment concluded. Some headed to work, others to taverns, most to homes where they'd tell the story with various embellishments. By evening, some versions would have Margaret's head speaking accusations. Others would have Henry weeping on the scaffold. Truth was always the first casualty of storytelling. Henry returned to his workshop, where the day's second task waited. A thief, convicted of stealing bread repeatedly, despite lesser punishments, scheduled for branding rather than death. The irons were properly heated now, their ends glowing with the particular cherry red that meant they'd mark clean without excessive burning. The thief was young, maybe 16, maybe younger, hunger having aged him prematurely. He struggled against the guards until he saw Henry's face, professional and impassive as carved stone. Something in that expression spoke louder than threats, and the boy stilled, trembling but no longer fighting. "Hand or forehead?" Henry asked, offering the only choice available. "Hand," the boy whispered. "Can hide a hand. Can't hide a face." Henry nodded, understanding the brutal calculus. A branded hand meant difficulty finding work, but not impossibility. A branded forehead meant a lifetime of doors closing before you reached them. He secured the boy's arm with leather straps, positioning it on the branding block with the same care he'd positioned Margaret's neck. Different tool, different outcome, same attention to minimizing unnecessary suffering. "Deep breath," he advised. "Look away. It's faster than you think." The iron touched flesh with a sound like bacon hitting a hot pan. The boy screamed, they always did, no shame in it, but Henry held the iron steady for exactly the count of 3. Too short, and the brand wouldn't take, requiring a second application. Too long, and the burn went too deep, risking infection that killed more surely than any axe. The T for thief stood out angry red against pale flesh, a letter that would darken to permanent reminder. Henry applied salve with gentle efficiency, wrapping the hand in clean linen that the boy would probably sell within the hour, infection be damned. Survival trumped healing, in the arithmetic of poverty. By midday, Henry's official work was done. He cleaned his tools one final time, oiled the axe blade against rust, banked the coals in the brazier. The scaffold would stand empty until next time, maybe days, maybe weeks, depending on how well the town behaved itself. The walk home took him through streets that parted around him like water around a stone. He was necessary but untouchable, respected but not welcomed, feared but not hated. The executioner's paradox, to be the town's hand of justice while standing forever outside its embrace. His cottage sat at the town's edge, far enough for comfort but close enough for quick summons. The garden behind it grew surprisingly well, fertilized by the blood money that everyone pretended didn't exist. His wife had tended roses there before the fever took her, and he'd maintained them in her memory, their red blooms a different kind of reminder than the stains on the scaffold. Inside he ate his meal in silence, bread from the baker who'd watched the execution, ale from the brewer who'd placed bets on it, cheese from the dairyman who turned away when Henry passed. All of them implicated in the machinery of justice, all of them pretending their hands were cleaner than his. Through his window, he could see the day's progression. Edmund the rat-catcher heading to another granary, a few lingerers at the scaffold touching the wood for luck or curse, smoke rising from the plague pit, where bodies burned instead of rotting. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades that reminded him uncomfortably of heated iron. Evening would bring its own rituals. Checking tomorrow's work orders, maintaining his secondary tools, the pincers for torture, the brands for different crimes, the hooks for the truly heinous. Perhaps reading from the Bible his wife had left marked at Ecclesiastes, "To everything there is a season." The town's rhythms were winding down now. Robert, the leech collector, had long since returned from the Marsh. Blood paid for, blood drawn. Thomas the gong farmer was preparing for another night's descent into the town's bowels. William the plague pit digger was washing the day's lime from his hands. Edmund counted his rat tails. Simon checked his bear's chains. And Henry the executioner cleaned the edge of mercy one more time, preparing for tomorrow's possibilities. They were all part of the same machine, these men who did what others couldn't stomach. Without them, the town would drown in its own waste, succumb to its own vermin, fall to its own diseases, be overrun by its own violence. They were the unglamorous antibodies in civilization's bloodstream, fighting infection and corruption in ways that required strong stomachs and steady hands. As full darkness fell, the town settled into sleep. The scaffold stood empty, a geometric shadow against stars that neither judged nor absolved. The block waited for its next appointment. The axe rested, edge gleaming with oil and attention. Tomorrow would bring its own necessities, perhaps another execution, perhaps just maintenance, perhaps nothing at all but the weight of waiting. But tonight the town slept safely, its sins punished, its order maintained, its justice delivered by hands that would never be clean, no matter how much they scrubbed. Henry closed his door against the cold, trimmed his candle and prepared for bed. In his dreams, the axe would fall clean every time. Mercy and justice balanced perfectly on a blade's edge that never wavered. But morning would come, as it always did, with frost on the scaffold and work to be done. The executioner slept, and the town breathed around him, grateful for his service, horrified by his necessity, forever caught between need and revulsion. Let the night be gentle now. The streets are quiet, the chains are checked, the pits are filled, the The Marsh sleeps, the granary stands defended, and justice, terrible and necessary, has been served. The year has turned through its cycle of labour and death, maintenance and survival. These men who work in darkness and filth, in blood and terror, in the spaces between civilization and its collapse, they've earned their rest. Sleep well, in beds bought with coins no one wants to trace, in houses where neighbours nod but don't visit, in the knowledge that tomorrow the town will need you again, even as it wishes it didn't. Good night. Thank you for listening one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace. Good night.